Our reading this morning is from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 24, verses 1 through 12. This is the story of the women at Jesus' tomb early on that Easter morn. On the first day of the week at early dawn, the women came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared to embalm Jesus' body. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, and when they went in, they did not find his body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces, but the men said to them, "Why? Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, he has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over and crucified, and on the 3rd day rise again." The women remembered Jesus' words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the disciples. But they did not believe the women. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen clothes by themselves, and then he returned home, amazed at what had happened. Several years ago, without ever intending to, I skipped the resurrection, by which I mean I missed Easter entirely. You see, I was on sabbatical that spring, so it was a rare year I wasn't leading my congregation in Easter services. My husband, Chris, was invited to give a lecture in Sydney, and I insisted on tagging along. And so, without paying too much attention to the calendar, we booked our flight for a Saturday in late March. Only later did we realize our flight departed the day before Easter. And by the time our plane landed in Sydney, 20-some hours later, it was already Monday morning. And I was like, wait, what? I missed Easter? Sometime during that long flight to the other side of the world, Christians all across the globe had celebrated Easter Sunday. They'd heard the story of the empty tomb and the risen Christ, and they'd sung their alleluias. But not me, not that year. When I got back to the States and shared this story with a friend, she said, "Don't Unitarians always play hooky on Easter Sunday?" And one of my more orthodox Christian colleagues poked fun at me. He said, "So you missed the resurrection one year, big deal. You Unitarians have been missing the point of the resurrection all along." And it's true that we Unitarian Universalists typically find more meaning in Jesus' life and teachings than in his death and resurrection. But you know what I've come to realize over the years? I need Easter. I need every year a story that reminds me that love is stronger than death. I need a story that reminds me of our capacity to begin anew even when all seems lost. I need a story that reminds me that when what we might perceive to be dead ends in our lives can turn into surprising new beginnings. I need that story in my life. I missed the resurrection once, and I will not do it again. And if I might be confessional for a moment, The truth is, this is one of those years when my soul is really crying out for the Easter story. I don't know, it might be lingering grief from the pandemic and its many losses. It may be that even as we anticipate Earth's spring awakening, I'm more aware than ever of the existential threat of climate change. Or it may be that I'm just beaten down by the news of children gunned down in their schools and petty autocrats who think they can push the rest of us around. I know you feel these sorrows too, and others. And so I hope you'll forgive me if on this Easter Sunday, this day of hopeful new beginnings, part of my heart is still back on Good Friday, right? The day Jesus was crucified, a day defined by loss and suffering and despair. All too often, my heart feels stretched between these two poles of the Easter story, by these two realities of the world that we live in. On one hand, the reality of suffering and sorrow, and on the other, the promise of life born anew. But this is the world we live in, isn't it? What are we to do with it all? What do we do when we feel caught between the Good Friday-ness of our world and its Easter Sunday-ness? For me, the passage from Luke's Gospel that we read earlier points one way forward. Remember that the passage begins with the women coming to the tomb with spices to embalm their friend's body. They hadn't come for a resurrection. They'd come for a burial. They were still living in a Good Friday world. And when they arrive at the tomb to find the tomb empty, two angels ask them a question. The angels say, "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" And in the story, this question is meant ironically, as in, well, why would you show up at a tomb looking for one who is risen? But I think that we, the reader, are meant to take this question to heart. Why would we look for the living among the dead? And one possible answer to that question is because we have no other choice. We look for the living among the dead because we live in a world with many crosses. The cross of war and violence, the cross of pain and suffering, the cross of racism and systemic oppression. And if we don't seek out life in precisely these places, then what are we left with? I've come to believe that perhaps the only way we can move our spirits, and our world for that matter, along the path from Good Friday to Easter Sunday is by doing precisely what the angels suggest, by learning to find the living among the dead. Learning to find hope amidst despair. Learning to find joy in the midst of our sorrow. Learning to discover beauty amidst the brokenness of our world. This is the work of resurrection. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not inviting us to kind of move on past our pain and suffering. I'm asking us to take them seriously, but to also take seriously the discipline of discovering hope and resilience right in the midst of those places of pain and suffering, right in the midst of the places of injustice and violence. That's what it means to live as Easter people in what sometimes feels like a Good Friday world. It's to take as our spiritual discipline the practice of discovering, nurturing, and celebrating life in the midst of death. Discovering, nurturing, and celebrating joy, even in the midst of sorrow. Finding the living among the dead. I want to just share a brief story that I think illustrates this practice of finding the living among the dead. Back in the 1980s, that sounds like a long time ago now, doesn't it? Back in the 1980s, a friend and colleague of mine was the minister of the Unitarian Universalist Meeting House in Provincetown, Massachusetts. And this was at the terrible beginning of the AIDS epidemic. And the UU Church in P-Town was a hub of mutual care and political advocacy for those living with HIV. Nevertheless, people were dying en masse, and the Provincetown Church was filled with ghosts. I'll never forget my colleague told me about a group of 3 men in her church. They were best friends and all pillars of the church, and every Sunday they sat together in the front row. My friend remembers the awful week when all 3 of them died, and the next Sunday the pew was empty. One bright June Sunday, in the midst of it all, my friend had had a long day. First there was Sunday worship, followed by a memorial for someone who died of HIV, and then a June wedding on the front lawn. By evening, my friend was exhausted and ready to go home. But as she walked out of church that evening, one of her congregants, we'll call him Ted, came up to her and said, "Hey, my boat's down at the dock. Why don't we go for a ride tonight?" My colleague fought the urge to say, "I'm exhausted. Please, not now." But she knew Ted probably didn't have too much longer, and so she hopped on board with him. Together they motored out onto the glistening waters of Cape Cod Bay, and until Ted shut off his engine, and they just sat together quietly, looking back at Provincetown glowing in the evening light. And after a long silence, Ted said to my friend, "You know, it still matters. Even if one day this disease claims us all, it matters that while we were here, that we loved one another, and we cared for one another, and we fought for one another's lives, and laughed and played. It matters, doesn't it?" "You're right, Ted," she said. "It does matter." Finding the living among the dead. Cherishing beauty in the midst of suffering. Celebrating love. Discovering hope when hope is hard to find. This is what it means to be Easter people. And in the end, friends, we don't have to take the Bible's word for it. Our own lives have borne ample witness, haven't they, to the possibility of resurrection. Friends, in just a few moments, we will join our children outside in the old Cambridge burying ground for their annual Easter egg hunt. And there they will run and leap and laugh among the tombstones as they search for an egg, the symbol of fertility, the symbol of life. We couldn't have made it more plain, could we? We've set for them the task of discovering the living among the dead. And every few moments, a child will stop and smile and reach down into the grass and pull up an egg and say, "I found it. I found it." So may it be so. And happy Easter. And amen.